feel free to get up and take advantage of those if you need to. There's cardamom hot chocolate and tea. Anything else, Adri?
Decaf coffee.
Decaf coffee in the back. Help yourself to that. And then we've got ginger snaps and other fancy things. So you guys are welcome here tonight. Make yourselves at home. I think you're going to enjoy what we've got. So I want to introduce Lanier Ivester. So Lanier is the author of Glad and Golden Hours. Can I see? Glad and Golden Hours, which releases officially in the public October 21st, but it's available now. What did I say?
October 1st.
October 1st, I'm sorry, not the 21st. I'm getting my books mixed up. But it's available now through the Rap Room store. And we're celebrating that release here tonight. So I've known Lanier since, I think, like 2007-ish. In the early days of the Rabbit Room, there was this person that I noticed kept commenting on things and just had wonderful things to say. And I clicked on her name to find out who is this person. And it took me to our website. And it was just full of wonderful blog posts. I really enjoyed your writing. And so we invited you to come write with the Rabbit Room, which was the beginning of, our relationship, I guess. And then it wasn't long after that I met my wife, Jennifer. And one of the first things that we did as a dating couple was visit you and Philip at your house in Smyrna. And she taught us how to bind books.
That's right.
She loved books, adored books, was trying to write something of her own, and was binding her own. And it was such a precious memory to me. And we've known each other ever since. She's been a speaker at almost every Hutchmoot, if not every Hutchmoot.
Not everyone. I missed
Not
two.
everyone? Okay, she missed 2. So she's been a speaker at 13 Hutchmoots, something like that. She's been a writer for the Rabbit Room blog for ages. She's been published in the Molehill. She's written liturgies for Every Moment Holy. What am I forgetting? She's a poet. She's just a short story writer. Anyway, so for the last, almost a decade, she's been tinkering with a book of her own. And Jennifer and she have been plotting on this book, which is what they're going to talk about tonight. So everybody give a big hand to Lanier Ivester. And then the other person that I need to introduce is Jennifer Trafton, who's sitting over here, and she'll come on screen here in a minute. But Jennifer is my wife, of whom I'm very proud. She's a writer in her own right. She's an artist. And this book is kind of the biggest art project she has ever taken on. It's full of over 200 illustrations, I believe, handcrafted by her over the last several years. And it's just been a real labor of love that's born out of their friendship. And I'm looking forward to you guys hearing a bit of that story tonight. So please welcome illustrator Jennifer Trafton.
Well, I met Lanier at dinner time at the very first Hutchmoot ever. So it was August 2010. And we just happened to sit at the same table together and figured out pretty immediately that we were kindred spirits, sailors, loved all the same writers, and that friendship has just been one of the treasures of my life over the past, 14 years? Oh my goodness.
14 years.
And in all that time that I've known Lanier, she's talked about she wants to write a book, and she's written several over the course of that time that haven't been published yet. And we kept trying to think of a project we could do together someday. We started one, and oh no, I knew I was going to do that.
Make sure mine's on. Mine has a red light.
Can you tell, Andy? Okay.
Okay, sorry about that. So, can you hear Lanier, Andy? She's okay. Make sure. So we've been trying to come up with this project we could do together for a long time, and this ended up just being the perfect thing. So today is my honor to watch Lanier unbox her very first book. And I'm so proud of you. I'm so excited to get to be part of that experience with you.
Well, I'm proud of us. This was definitely a joint project. And
it's been a labor of love.
If ever a book was born out of friendship, it's this one.
So I get to put Lanier on the hot seat tonight and interview her, which I'm much more comfortable doing than the other way around. So I want to start with your childhood. If you don't know Lanier, I think that she was just born loving beauty and probably in a 1940s dress, like from the cradle onward. And you were called the Christmas fairy, right, growing up. You loved Christmas from a very early age, and you loved all the pageantry and the ritual and the beauty and the drama of it. And from what I know of you and your journey, a lot of your life has been about those beautiful ideals crashing up against hard reality and human limitations again and again. And one of my favorite stories from the book is, I don't know how old you were.
I was 14.
14, okay. It involves a fancy headdress and candles. And would you tell us the story of St. Lucia's Day?
Yes, I would love to. So when I was I'm not sure how far to back up here, but when I was 14, my parents started homeschooling, and back then, that was a minute ago, but there were not the resources that there are now. So, it was very much my mom and my brother and my sister and me at the kitchen table. But that first year, I realized pretty quickly that as much as I had balked against the idea of homeschooling at the beginning, that suddenly I had in my life what Anne Shirley would call scope for the imagination. I had room that I had not had before to just embody some of the things that I had idealized and loved and dreamed about and enjoyed. And there's one thing, I have never been particularly discouraged when I encounter something beautiful in a book or a magazine. It just makes me want to figure out some way to embody it in my own life, particularly when I was young and thought anything was possible. So that Christmas, there was kind of a convergence in things. My sister was the proud recipient of a Kirsten doll, the Pleasant Company dolls, the year before. And so she had all of the Swedish customs and the Lucia dress and all that. And I had the Samantha doll, and that was perfect for me, but I was a little envious of like her Christmas set. And then that fall, I read a book by Jenny Lindquist. I don't know if anyone's familiar. Andrea might be. She was a Swedish-American author of children's books, middle grade. Anyway, she described this pageantry of the Lucia Queen, like coming in the dark hours of December the 13th and waking her family with carols and a tray of homemade buns. And, it was just this symbolic transition from darkness to light. It was originally believed to be the winter solstice on the 13th by some of the older calendars. And so, I saw this picture in the book of this girl in the long dress and the candles. But the most beautiful thing was that she had this gorgeous headdress of holly with real lighted candles. And if there's anything my husband can tell you that I have a weakness for, it is botanical headpieces and lighted candles. And when you put them together, it was absolute perfection. And so I came up with, my mother, was 3 months into homeschooling. She was already getting really burned out. And I said, I have an idea. Let's, Liz, my sister, and my brother Zach, and I could each do a Christmas project, and we'll choose a country, and we will do a presentation for the rest of the family on this country. Of course, I had already chosen my country. And my sister was a little bit miffed that I had beat her to Sweden, but she was good-natured about it. So anyway, my brother and sister, and I write about it in the book. They did their projects, which had their own humor, but when it came time for me to present my Lucia Queen radiance to my family, it was, unfortunately, I had to wait till the sun was already up because people would have been mad at me if I'd gone into their bedrooms and woken them up before it was light. But so my family was all waiting in the living room, and I brewed my Swiss Miss hot chocolate, and I was so excited. I didn't know the Swedish carols, so I just picked one of my favorite carols that I was going to sing. And when the time came, I pulled my wreath that I'd made out of hiding, and the candles that I'd, pinched from my mom's candle drawer, and lit them and put it on my head, and went walking as slowly as I could, because I didn't want the candles to blow out, through the house and into the living room with my tray and singing, and I just knew my family was just going to be agog, when I walked in, and they were. My mother could hardly speak, and before she could say anything, this trickle of hot wax just seared the wreath into my head. And the problem was that I had made the wreath out of cat briars, vines, that I had seen growing out my window, and I thought that they had pretty little tendrils and everything. Well, they have thorns. And so it was not exactly what I was expecting, or what they were expecting. But my mother convinced me to blow the candles out before I finished the rest of my presentation, which was kind of sad, but I was really ready for the wax to stop. I thought that wreath was going to be connected to my head for the rest of my life. We did have to cut it to pieces to get it off.
I was like, how did you get it off?
Yeah, we had to cut it apart. I had to keep my head in the sink with hot water, for.
So did you learn your lesson after this?
No.
Well, you have that and many other stories of growing up in the Adams family, and how much Christmas meant to you. And the book is dedicated to your mother, Claudia Adams. And she's been the inspiration for so much of, not just the book, but the way that you are a host, and the way that you think about the home and hospitality. And she passed away during the writing of this book, which we'll talk more about later. But when you look back at all those years, Christmas in the Adams house, what are you still trying to preserve today of that time? What are the things that you're trying to pull out of that past and keep nurturing in the present?
So I love that question, because the things that were special about Christmas in our house were special about everyday life in our house. And Christmas certainly augmented it. But my mother was so good at curating our family traditions, but letting them be organic at the same time. And because she had that level of intention without it being burdensome, it gave my brother and my sister and me this continuity and connectivity that persists to this day. And that's really special, because it's something that it's difficult to put into words, and that's why these traditions that we held as a family express things that we couldn't necessarily otherwise. And an example of that, I write about this in the book, but every Christmas, my mother would make this, we called it the sacrosanct Christmas morning casserole. It was only for Christmas, and she made it I don't remember a Christmas that she didn't make it. And when you would smell the sausage cooking on Christmas Eve, you would just get so excited, because you knew, it was all coming. And that was just such a signal, to all of us. And I remember after I got married, I asked her for the recipe, and she would not give it to me. Because, well, for one, she wanted us to come there for breakfast. But also, I think she was afraid of me using it for other times that were not Christmas. I really think that was the big concern. But the sweet irony of that is this past, was it May, Philip, that we, my siblings, we live very far apart, and back in May, we were all together in one place for a week of family vacation. We hadn't been all together since last summer, and it was just a really, really special time, and I was looking forward to it so much. And the first morning that we were all together, it was a Sunday morning, and wasn't planned, but everybody just spontaneously started pulling presents out of their bags and, bringing presents to everybody because, there had been birthdays and people had gone on trips and picked up little things for each other. And so there was this huge present jamboree in the living room. And I was just kind of laughing in the back of the room because I knew what I had planned for breakfast. And everybody was like, oh my gosh, it feels like Christmas. And Philip said, y'all won't believe what we're having. And right about that time, the aroma starts wafting out of the kitchen, and my sister just started crying. But, it was just, they knew how much I loved them and how happy I was that they were there. And they knew that I knew it, I mean, it was just, so. But another thing, in a different vein, my mother was so good at embracing imperfection. And Jennifer knows me well enough to know that that is not something that comes naturally to me at all. But Mama was just so good at taking a situation that did not go the way she planned it to go, or that went very seriously awry, and turning it into a really funny story. And my parents they both had an incredible sense of humor. They both loved to laugh. But my mom loved to laugh at herself. And not in a self-demeaning way, but in just a really delightful way. And what she, I grew up in a very story-centric storytelling culture in our family. And one of the things that I picked up on from my mom rehearsing these funny stories on herself, like, for example, and this is just a little thing that comes to my mind right now, but I think it was the day before Thanksgiving one year, and my sister and my mom and I were all in the kitchen, and we were running around. It was this tiny little 1950s ranch kitchen, bumping into each other, and there was no counter space, and we were all making different things, and my mom was making something with flour. It must have been a cake or a pie crust or something. And she had the mixture on the counter, and she had all the drawers were open in the kitchen, and she reached into the flour canister and got a spoonful of flour and dumped it in one of the open drawers rather than in her mixing bowl. And she just, well, Claudia, but she loved to tell that story on herself, I was just doing too much at one time. But, she taught me that imperfections are what make life interesting. And so, that's something that I want to welcome into my home, even if that's not something that, with my personality that comes as naturally as it did to her. So.
Well, speaking of imperfection, I think that leads into a more serious example, which is, I don't remember which year it was that you had a house fire.
2017.
I'm sure you have it seared
May
into your
the 26th.
Yeah. And Lanier and Philip's house, it's called the Rough House. It is an absolutely beautiful, beautiful old 19th century farmhouse. And it has been, Pete told you that one of our first dates, he says I need to be talking louder. One of our first dates was at Lanier and Philip's house. And it has been for me just this oasis over the years of hospitality and welcome and homely beauty. And in 2017, there was a dryer fire, and you were forced out of that house for a year. Lived in a camper in the backyard for a year while all your possessions were basically in storage or being cleaned.
Or in the dumpster.
And your house was gutted and being restored. Mm-hmm. And it's a devastating story that you're going to tell in another book someday.
Yes.
But I remember you saying at the time, and I think you talk about this in the book too, that you really had to wrestle, not just with Christmas at Camp Mara, which is Camp Sorrow is what you called it, but all of those ideals of home and hospitality being sacramental, all of those things were put to a test in that little camper in a way that had never been before. And you had to wrestle with the fact that if it's not true at Camp Mara, it's not true anywhere. Mm-hmm. So that Christmas that you spent at Camp Mara, what was it that was still true? what was it that, amidst like all the traditions and stuff that went out the window and your beautiful house and your dishes and everything else, what still mattered?
Well,
at the heart
Jesus
of it?
came. That was crystal clear. And how much we need a Savior.
Yeah.
That was a situation that really took me to the ground in so many ways. And I was desperate for Jesus that Christmas, and I realized how much I need him. I realized, as Jennifer said, very quickly. In fact, I realized it not experientially, but in theory, as I was following that camper down the driveway when they were delivering it. Like I was coming from the hotel where we were staying, and I pulled in the driveway right after this camper, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's my house. And it was just trundling, bouncing down my driveway, and I just felt like the Lord said to me, like, everything that's true at the Rough House is going to be true in that camper. And I did not know what to do with that or what that meant, but I knew I was going to find out. I realized very quickly that homemaking and hospitality and beauty had absolutely nothing to do with our circumstances at all. And in fact, like the hospitality to a humorous degree, I just do feel like God does have a sense of humor in some of the situations he allows us to get in that are just so ridiculous. But we had more house guests that year. And Jennifer can tell you, we had an Abby Pickle and Julie Mallant. Like, we had so many people come and stay with us during that year. And of course, we were in this camper, and so we had to bring, the camper was provided by our insurance company, so it was like a great big 34-foot camper, and we have a 24-foot vintage Airstream. And so we pulled the Airstream over adjacent to the camper to house our guests.
You had this like tent city out there.
Yes,
in the back.
and you stayed in it,
I stayed in
and John Cow came and visited one time, and he stayed in the Scamp. Like,
At one point, you had Matthew Clark in his
we
van
had
as
Matthew.
well.
I mean, we.
You had
It was like an encampment. We had so much company, and it was just so beautiful because everybody that came was part of that story. I think I just lost the thread here, but anyway, hospitality, was just so key. And there were times that we'd have so many people packed in that camper. You could have 5 cats and 2 dogs. Like, you just couldn't even move. And another time in that same vein, Heidi and Glenn Johnson came, and they were planning to come and stay with us in our house, but that was not possible. So they stayed in a hotel and came and just visited us in the camper. And the day before, I'd thrown my back out and spent all day in the emergency room getting morphine, and I had terrible sciatica. It was awful. And so by the time the Johnsons came, I couldn't do anything. All I could do was sit on the sofa and let Heidi make me tea. Which was really beautiful, and I just realized, that's the side of hospitality too, is receiving. But yeah, and just there's so much I could say about that, and I do kind of pull that out some in the book, but realizing that I had an opportunity to make a home in the wilderness, but that a home had already been made for me in the character of God, and all I had to do was, be welcome there.
So many other questions I want to ask you, and I'm trying to. I know we don't have time for all of them. This book is called Glad and Golden Hours, which sounds very happy, feel-good, cozy Christmas book. It's got recipes, got crafts, got all kinds of things like that. But there's also a lot of loss and grief that you talk about throughout the book. There's the house fire. There's the death of your parents. There's you talk a lot about your struggles with infertility and the unfulfilled longing for motherhood. And so there's a lot of loss.
I'm sorry, y'all, it is a little.
So why didn't you call it Dark and Depressing Hours? Why?
Well, if y'all will humor me, I'm just going to quote the verse that this phrase is from, and Jennifer illustrated it so beautifully in the frontispiece. But if it's okay, I'll just go kind of back to the origins of that phrase, because that is a very legitimate question, and one I've asked myself too. So the title of the book comes from, I think it's the third verse. It's a lesser-known verse from Edmund Sears.
One of the two.
Anyway, who wrote "It Came Upon the Midnight Clear," which I think is just one of the most beautiful carols. But you don't often hear this one, and I will try to quote it from memory. I might need some prompting, but this verse goes, "O ye beneath life's crushing load, whose forms are bending low, who toil along the climbing way with painful steps and slow. Look now, for glad and golden hours come swiftly on the wing. Oh, rest beside the weary road and hear the angels sing." And that, from my girlhood, like that verse just really captured my heart and my imagination. But I think what I'm really trying to point out here is that those glad and golden hours are not so much the destination as an arrow, pointing to a reality that we cannot experience in its completeness this side of heaven, but that doesn't mean we can't experience it in places and in ways and in tangible ways. That just because we don't have that completed reality doesn't mean it's not real. But also the fact that this book comprises both Advent and Christmastide, which I think that we, in our culture, we get robbed of the golden part, of the season, because Advent is a space that holds our grief, and it's supposed to be that way. I mean, we have lots of Christmas parties and fun things that happen during Advent too, but Advent is a place for our grief and our questions and our longings. But Christmastide makes room for our joy. It's a feast. Like, Advent is a preparation for a feast, and we need both because we have both in this life, and because the grief isn't the end of the story. And so I think just being able to acknowledge that and articulate that and embody that in truly joyful ways, even in the very midst of the dark and the depressing, is just really a statement of our faith, and it's an articulation of what we believe.
And when you say Christmastide, you mean all 12
I mean the
days.
whole thing, like
12
all
days.
12 days.
Yeah. So you balance the darkness of Advent with
a whole
lot of feasting.
Yeah.
Well, before we leave the darkness and the depressing topics, but your mom died in the middle of the writing of this book. That was a huge, huge turning point in so many ways for this project. And we had started this 3 years ago, almost exactly. We had come up with this great idea at Lanier's kitchen table and started it, and ground to a halt because you had a year of so much grief. And then we picked it up again. So this is a book that's been on a journey, a really dramatic one. So can you talk a little bit about that process and the journey that the book has gone on, but how you have changed in that time as well?
Well, after we'd gotten pretty deep in this project, as Jennifer said, and then after I was able to finally return to the manuscript after, it sounds very Victorian, but really, it was a year. I realized, looking back over what I'd already written, that my mother was already all over this book. And I also realized this is her book. And I, subconsciously or no, I'd already been threading her in. When you're grieving someone, you realize the impact that they have had on you and the way that they have shaped you. And I kind of feel like it may seem obvious to other people that are close to me, like how much my mother has shaped me. But, just really being able to dig into that story and just the finishing that manuscript and then the revision process, which was so fun, Pete. Like, you're the best editor. Was so beautiful for me because it was a way to process my grief in a very creative way. It was so healing, and it gave me so much joy. I felt like I got to spend so much time with my mother, and so that brought a goldenness to the project for me that wasn't there before. But also losing, and Philip and I lost all 4 of our parents within a relatively short amount of time. I mean, 3 of our parents within like a year. And that experience, like, I would have told you 3 years ago that relationships are what matter, and I would have believed that. But going through, that much loss and realizing, oh yeah, we know this experientially now. Our relationships with God and each other are the only things that matter. Like, it's not a hierarchy, that this matters more than this. Like, that's what matters. But all of these ways that we can articulate our love and embody these realities they're so precious. Like, they have more meaning to me than before, because I understand in a deeper way that their ability to communicate our love and our hope. And that's really, really precious to me. So I just feel like the significance is even greater than it was before. Like, bringing these physical objects, whether it's decorations or food or, things that you're doing to acknowledge what's happening in the church year. And Philip and I are Anglicans, and one of the things that we love so much about the Anglican tradition is the opportunity every week to just kind of act out the drama of our faith in company with other believers, and articulating our relationship with God and our relationship with each other. And I just really believe that to a much lesser degree that's true of our personal observances and our traditions. And
I feel like that leads beautifully into the chapter that you're about to read, which is all about your mother's table.
Yeah.
Right?
All right. So, yeah. All right. Well, I am going to share a reading from Glad and Golden Hours. This is such a privilege. Y'all, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for live stream friends for being here too. This is incredibly, incredibly special. So, okay, so I'm going to put my glasses on because I can't read my own book. Okay, this essay is called The Empty Table, and you'll see in the book, but the book is structured around a narrative of connected essays, some more connected than others, and then it's threaded with recipes and crafts and ways to embody these things. So anyway, all that said, The Empty Table. The year my mother died, the holidays felt like one more mountain to climb after a succession of seemingly endless ranges of exhaustion and grief. A couple of days before Thanksgiving, I went over to Mama's house. It would always be Mama's house to me, though Mama had gone from it forever. And as soon as I opened the back door, the emotions rushed over me again. There was the pool table around which so many friends had gathered over the years, the velvet sofa, its down pillow backs permanently dented by Mama's black lab Portia, the wild boar's head my daddy shot with a bow and arrow, and which we ate on for months from small white wrapped parcels in the freezer. Every house has a scent. One of Elizabeth Gouge's homes smelled most memorably of old wood and lemon oil and dog. Ours was always wood smoke and cedar and candles and books. And this time the aroma greeted me as kindly as ever, if perhaps a bit reproachfully. The truth was I hadn't been over there in weeks. After nearly 5 months of ceaseless work, we had listed it on the market back in October, and I had vowed within my heart not to so much lay eyes on the for sale sign in the yard until I absolutely had to. Cleaning out the Chestnut Drive house was the hardest thing I'd ever done, and yet it was one of the most precious and meaningful experiences of my life. I felt like an archaeologist excavating a happy past, a past that present sufferings had temporarily obscured. Time and again, I sat in those silent rooms, weeping over some unknown or unremembered evidence of our parents' love for us and for each other. Cards and letters, prayer journals, Bible notes, book inscriptions, baby spoons, and bits of broken china carefully glued back together. In a stash of gifts on the floor of my mother's closet one day, I found a plaque that I knew she had intended as a Christmas present for me. Courage, dear heart. After mopping my eyes, I hung it on a nail in the now empty wall in the den beside the pool table, and it was the last thing I took out of the house with me when the realtor showed up with the lockbox and that odious sign. Today, however, I braved the silence and strange emptiness for 2 items. Mama's woven cornucopia, which I'd spotted months back in the storage shed, and Great Aunt Tiny's stylized painting of lantern flowers, which we'd left hanging over the fireplace in the living room. The former was requisite for my Thanksgiving table. The latter, I'd realized, would look lovely in my front hall. Up in the storage house, I secured my prize, and back in the living room, I gently lifted Aunt Tiny's painting off the brick wall. Then I wandered through the quiet rooms, closing closet doors realtors had left open, turning on certain lamps and turning off others. In the laundry room, I remembered the shock of sorrow over cleaning out the utility closet. For in a real home, there is no such thing as the purely utilitarian. It's all sacred, down to the corncob holders and picnic napkins, the dryer sheets and the brooms. The only things left in the kitchen were the teapot and 3 cups that our agent had left for the staging, and Mama's kettle on the stove, which looked so natural there that it had naturally been overlooked. I smiled and left it. Coming through into the dining room, however, I nearly choked over the sob that rose in my throat. There was Mama's table, her favorite piece of furniture in the house, its homely pine surface dark with varnish and age. How we used to tease and roll our eyes every time she pulled out her point-and-shoot camera and later her cell phone to snap yet another picture of us sitting around that table enjoying a meal together. We're going to have the most boring photo albums on earth, one of us would quip. Who wants to look at a bunch of people eating? But Mama knew what the rest of us had to learn, that the best moments in life are not the exceptional ones, but the ones that it was easy to miss altogether. I thought now of all the jolly feasts we had shared there together, the first time Philip had come for dinner, the holidays and special occasions, the homeschool mornings when it was littered with books and binders and mugs of cinnamon lace coffee. I thought more recently of little tea times with Mama, or lunches of our favorite Chinese takeout. I thought of her ubiquitous camera. Even when Mama's illness had robbed her of the articulate conversation she was known for, it was still important for her to acknowledge the sacredness of this space, this domestic altar, as it were. Here, she would say, clutching the corners of the table with both hands and smiling at me with soft eyes. Right here. I know, Mama, I know. Packing up the photo albums a few weeks earlier, I had flipped through hundreds of pictures of us sitting around that table together, and it was far from boring. It was beautiful. One of the loveliest sights on earth, though I completely took it for granted at the time. In spite of the unreason of it all, I thought that we would always be going over there for dinners and everyday festivities, Christmas morning breakfasts and just because tea parties. I imagined that the big freezer in the laundry room would always be stuffed with dove and quail, rainbow trout, and sweet white perch from Daddy's hunting and fishing expeditions. I assumed that nothing would ever change. A few days later, Philip and I carried that table out under a sodden sky. Of course it's raining, he said. I don't mean to sound irreverent, I replied as we squished across the backyard, but this feels like the stripping of the altar. I had a hard time settling into Advent that year. I was seized with a weariness that seemed to seep from the recesses of my soul out into the very limbs of my body. Even with the delightful prospect of a house full of guests, both for Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, I found myself paring back lists and tasks that would have been easy to manage in a less demanding year. I had the beautiful liturgies and traditions of my church to carry me, and the company of faithful friends, both new and old, with whom to make this sacred pilgrimage. I had my hymns and carols, my poetry books, and my prayer book, a few cherished decorations sacred to Philip's and my story, and a few newly assimilated treasures sacred to the story of the family in which I'd grown up. My heart was usually brimming with expectation this time of year. But as I sat in the glittering dark beside my Christmas tree in the mornings, I felt hollow. Every year I've asked Jesus to visit me and those in my care in a unique and specific way, to meet us in those places of our lives that most need tending. That year, however, Advent felt more like Lent, a tenebrae pall over the chambers of my heart. When I asked Jesus to come to remember me with some healing image of his love in my mind or in my circumstances, all I could picture was a small, dark enclosure, like the cell of an anchoress buried in the walls of a church. Then one morning I thought of something else, my mother's table. I'd snapped a photo back on that November day, but even as I reached for my phone to pull it up, I understood what it meant. That table was me, empty, barren, skinned to the bone with sorrow. I was completely depleted. And even as I was preparing to spread all these tables in the coming days for people I loved, this was a table I could not set. Please, Lord, I whispered into the silence of my den. I'm not even sure what it means, but please set this table. I had nothing to offer other than my emptiness, but it was enough. All that was required, in fact. I sensed that this picture was both an image and an invitation. I would like to say that Jesus laid that board till it groaned, and in a way he did. It was one of the sweetest Christmases we had known, not just in spite of, but in the very face of grief. The tender love of Christ was very real to me as I moved through my days and my preparations. It seemed at times as though a silent, sorrowful presence companioned me, holding space for my grief. At other moments, I found myself laughing gently with the Lord over the fact that in years past, I would have lost sleep over things like unfinished Christmas shopping and unwrapped gifts. But that year, my mantra was exquisitely clear. The only things that mattered were that he was with us and that we were together. Perfect imperfection not only ruled over all my preparations, it carried me when my preparations fell by the wayside, for everything else faded before a feast of such love. And I began to understand what it means for God to prepare a table before us in the presence of our enemies. For what greater enemy is there than death? On Christmas night, my gaze traveled over the merry faces crowded around our table, each alight with a common joy and a shared hope, and I exulted over the kingship of Christ it signified. We could laugh and be silly, groan over awful cracker jokes, tell funny stories and savor special food, even when our hearts were breaking, because we knew where the story was going. Someday, when all things were restored, death itself would die for good and all. In another sense, I knew that the setting of that inner table would be a long process, one with which I could cooperate, but not dictate. Mama always used to say that it takes us as many days to recover from a trip as those in which we've been away. And perhaps grief has a parallel. Make us glad for as many days as you've afflicted us, the psalmist entreats. And I like to think that embedded in this request is the tacit acknowledgement that glad-making takes time. Grief is a capricious thing, and it has a heyday with archetypical loss. We will never, God knows, outgrow our need to be parented. But God, two of the most consoling words ever stitched together, does not leave us orphaned. He comes to us in our most quiet need, mothering and fathering us back to gladness, trading our mourning for the oil of joy.
So I just want to really quickly sum up the book. If anybody's not intimately familiar with it already, it is more than a cookbook. It's more than a craft book. It is those things, but I think you just heard it's so much more. It's called A Companion for Christmas and Advent and Christmastide, and it was a revelation to me even in the editing process. to discover the narrative that it tells, which is so beautiful. So I know that it looks like a cookbook, but I just want everybody here to understand this is a book that you can sit down and read, and it's going to move you, and you'll be glad you did. I often compare it to Robert Farrar Capon's Supper of the Lamb, which is one of my favorite books of all time. And people say, oh, what is it? I'm like, well, it's a cookbook, but it's also theology, but it's also really funny, and it's just great stories, and you just have to read it. And people go, oh, so it's a cookbook? I'm like, no! Yes! So anyway, it's that kind of book. I hope that sounds intriguing, not confusing. So I just want to take a few minutes here to see if you guys have any questions for Lanier or Jennifer. And I am comfortable waiting in awkward silence until somebody raises their hand.
There's water beside you if you need it.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious, okay, so you guys live far apart. I'm guessing you're in North Carolina?
She is in Atlanta.
Atlanta.
I'm just kidding. But how did you make it work? Like passing the vision, Jennifer catching it, and being able to give representation. Obviously friendship helps, but
That is a really fun question. Do
that's
you
a
want to
fun
start and then or jump
I
in?
can
Or?
tell my,
Yeah.
let you drink your water first.
Okay.
I was visiting, so we're about 5 hours apart, right? Five, 6 hours?
Four.
4 hours. It takes me 5 hours.
We drive faster than you. Philip
I
drives
took
really
a lot
fast.
of bathroom breaks. So I was visiting one right before Christmas. I think that I was depressed for some reason, and I needed some Lanier time. And so I drove down, and I just remember sitting at the kitchen table as Lanier is making her caramels, her gingerbread caramels, which are in the book, and we were making Christmas cookies. And you remember it differently than me, but like I don't really remember how we got started talking about, just all the things that you do for Christmas and the things that you are important to you that just kind of blow my mind, like ironing the napkins, like for her Christmas dinner every year, and she talked about like ironing napkins as a sacramental act, and I said, I don't understand this, but it's beautiful. I love the fact that you're like this, and I wish you would write about this for people. And you had an idea already stirring in your head, right? About
I did. Yeah. I mean, I've had a file on my computer. It's changed names a few times over the years, but essentially it was it wasn't this. It was much more probably surface level than this. But prior to our hatching this idea, I'll just back up a little bit.
Yeah.
Like Jennifer said, we met at Hutchmeet. We knew we were kindred spirits, and shortly after that, we realized that we'd found a safe place in each other for our work and our words, and we started kind of informally sharing our work, holding each other accountable to self-imposed deadlines, things like that. But I think it was like right after Diana Gleyer's keynote at Hutchmeet when she talked about, bandersnatching or like, just resonating, yes. And I was like, we're resonators. Like we have to make this happen. We don't live in the same town, but we can't let that be an excuse. And so we started meeting every Friday for tea over FaceTime. And sometimes we would share our work. We'd always talk about what we were working on. We'd always talk about what we were reading. Sometimes we would have already shared our work and, have comments on it. Or sometimes it would just be, thank you for catching my words this week. Don't read them. So that was in place.
You were writing another book at the
I
time.
was writing another book at the time, which she's read all of it.
Yeah.
God bless her. And so this is something I actually wanted to ask you about, Jennifer, and I'm just going to talk about it. but because we had that practice in place, like this book had a place to develop that it fell naturally into.
And it did develop a lot.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, and that's what I was going to say, actually, because Jennifer has such an incredible eye for, like, and you do too, of course, but like what's important here? Like what needs to be pulled forward? What do you need to foreground? And so you had already started to do that with my other book that I was working on, because I'd sent Jennifer, I'd written this book proposal and crossed every T, dotted every I, and I sent it to her, and she was like, "This is beautiful, and I'm reading it as your friend, but I'm also backing up reading it as a potential reader, and you're kind of glossing over the hard parts, the things that people are actually going to resonate with." And so you'd already helped me kind of identify that tendency, and so when we came to work on this book together, like you shaped the narrative as much as I did. I mean, that was you played a huge role in that.
The narrative is yours.
Well, yeah, but you.
It was fun to be able to talk about like what were the ideas and the themes, and so in the first stages we were just thinking about, just kind of dreaming of like, what are all the things that we could put in this book, and so like, we just had such a good time mapping out like what the structure of the book was going to be, and what were the different kinds of pieces. And it was also collaborative the other way. So Lanier has been involved in the visual development of the book. She, I created a palette with her, in mind, and her house in mind. And I'd go when I would visit her house, I'd take pictures of all the, the wallpaper she uses, or the decor of the book, and I can't, it's adapted and simplified. I can't steal it, but there's some William Morrissey kind of designs in there. And we talked about each of the sections, what was the color that symbolized that particular week of Advent for Lanier, and what were the images, the metaphors that we're gonna like. So even the artistic angle of the book was something that we were collaborating on and talking about. And it wasn't the sort of book where we sat down and said, okay, there's going to be 15 illustrations and this and that. We just dove in and said, whatever it is will be. And it
you had no idea what you were going to say.
But it was. Pete, this was not an easy book to lay out. It was like a massive puzzle of pieces that poor Pete had to put together.
It strengthened our marriage.
It did.
Well, and so much of the artwork couldn't be even not just completed, but started until the text was finalized. And so, I mean, I have it on good authority that Jennifer had blisters on her fingers from drawing, and
It was a mad rush. It
was intense.
So
it was really intense.
To go back to your question, there was a lot done over Facebook and email. We had a shared Pinterest account in which, because Lanier is a beautiful photographer and has just years and years of Instagram photos and pictures of her house, and so she would just fill this Pinterest account with photos that I could use as reference photos, as well as just design things that you liked. William Morris wallpaper designs that you liked and things like that. So we had this growing Pinterest account, and when she would send me a chapter, I would create some of the potential artwork and send it back to her. So it really was collaborative from beginning to end, and it was so much fun. I just can't imagine ever having another project that'll be this fun.
It was so
it's
fun.
Hard to,
it was so much work.
It was a lot of work, but it was really, really fun. Yeah.
Anybody else? Thanks, Kate. Other questions? Yes.
I'm curious, obviously as friends and as artists, what God taught you throughout the years about what it means to be an artist through this process, because I'm sure there were moments that were super hard, and what you learned about friendship, because I'm sure there were also moments where disagreements can happen. Just what you learned about being artists and what God taught you about friendship.
Can I make a comment? I know this isn't my show, but that raises, correct me if I remember incorrectly, but I seem to remember that the manuscript is mostly done, and then the house fire stuff got involved, and Jennifer
Yeah.
Like, this
I was
book
very
has to
reluctant.
include, and I feel like that was, like maybe you were resistant to that initially, you didn't see how that fit. And I think that's kind of getting it
Yeah.
a little bit, like there was a little bit of friction just to convince you, no, like this book needs to encompass that loss.
I think I wrote you a long email about why it didn't, and you didn't answer it.
I was not involved in the editorial process, but I had access to the manuscript, and just reading the comments back and forth between Lanier and Pete were like, it could be a sitcom. It was just,
I think
It was so
at one point Pete made a comment, and Lanier killed Pete in the dining room with the adverb.
That definitely happened.
so the question was, what have you learned about being an artist?
That you have to bare your soul. Like, you can't hold back. You can't hold things back for another time. I mean, everything has its place, but you have to just open a vein.
Is it also true that like, I think as part of the creative process, you don't hold back, you let all that out there, but then you have to trust the people around you to tell you when to hold back.
Oh,
or when
yeah.
to push
Yeah,
forward.
absolutely, yeah. And I think I tend to be more reticent than otherwise, but yeah, exactly. And it's, and to that point, like, it is not a solitary journey. I mean, and I love, like, the rabbit room, that's what the rabbit room exists to manifest. But I feel like Jennifer and I had a beautiful experience of that in shaping this book, because neither one of us could have done it without the other. Like, this book would not be this book. It would not be in existence if Jennifer hadn't illustrated it. You know, it just. But yeah, we need each other. We absolutely need each other. Now, it sounds kind of, trite, but it's so vital. The things we can't see on our own.
And can I add that, like, one of my favorite things about the book, we're talking about our friendship, but that your story and all the very recipes and stuff that are in this book all come out of your community. And so there's a whole cast of characters in this book that you get to know of Lanier's family and community. And a lot of the recipes are so-and-so's cookies, so-and-so's, so this is a book that really arose out of your own little community and all the things that they have given you. So it's collaborative in that sense as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thanks. Did that answer your question? Anybody else?
What is your favorite recipe from the cookbook?
Oh, what a fun question. Oh, gosh.
One of the drinks.
Oyster
One of the alcohol.
pie.
Oyster pie.
Oyster pie. It's a toss-up between oyster pie and the that cranberry bourbon shrub thing.
I have to say that when we were testing the recipes, like we had a core of, I don't know, 60-ish people testing recipes, and like we set up a spreadsheet where everybody could sign up to test various recipes, and the one for oyster pie just remained suspiciously
Well, Chris Backer did.
until Chris Backer stepped up to the plate and was happy with the result.
He's a good man.
Is your mom's Christmas breakfast recipe in here?
Yes.
It is no longer sacrosanct.
There's no well, yeah.
secret is out.
The secret is out.
Is there anybody in here that helped test recipes? Yeah, raise your hands high. Thank you, guys.
Yay! Y'all are the best. Yeah, that
Well,
was so fun.
maybe time for one more question. Okay, well, if nobody else has got a question, Janir.
She go by. That works. That's very.
Jennifer and Lanier are going to sign some books if anybody's interested. So the way that we're going to do that is, if anybody would like a book signed, line up at the far end of the So let me explain, thank you, Adri. That's great. Yeah, that's great. The gift box. So Jennifer has designed this wonderful printed box that matches the artwork of the book. And in the box, it's meant to give as a gift to somebody else. So within the box is a copy of the book, a custom tea towel featuring Jennifer's art, which Laura is modeling for us right now. And then a bottle of Madagascar bourbon vanilla, which is heavily referenced
It's a character in the book.
As well as an art print and some bookmarks. So it's a whole package of Glad and Golden Hour stuff that's great to give as a gift. So if you'd like, they're not available tonight, but if you'd like to pre-order